It was supposed to be a perfectly ordinary afternoon inside the walls of Buckingham Palace. The kind of day where everything moves in a predictable rhythm, where footsteps echo softly on polished marble floors, where staff members speak in hushed voices, and where every small detail has already been planned, reviewed, and approved days in advance. The royal household operated like clockwork, and everyone inside it understood their role. The guards stood at attention. The aides moved with quiet efficiency. The senior staff communicated through glances and nods. And at the center of it all, seated on their respective chairs during what was meant to be a private but formal palace engagement, were King Charles III and Queen Camilla. Nobody expected anything unusual that afternoon. And those who had worked inside the royal household for years would later say that they had seen nervous moments, tense exchanges, and the occasional bit of drama behind closed doors. But what happened during that particular visit was something that none of them had ever witnessed before. It was something that broke the quiet formality of the room and sent a ripple of shock through everyone present. Queen Camilla, in a single sharp moment, raised her hand and struck a royal officer. And within seconds of that happening, King Charles rose from his seat. To understand how that moment came to be, one has to understand who was in the room and why. The palace had arranged a formal afternoon meeting that included a small group of senior officers who were there to present a briefing on a matter of royal security protocol. These were experienced men, trained to carry themselves with absolute professionalism. They had spent years working within the Royal Protection Services and understood better than anyone the invisible boundaries that existed in any room where a member of the royal family was present. They spoke carefully, they moved carefully, and they never overstepped. That was the code they lived by. One of those officers, a man who had served in his position for nearly 2 decades, was standing near the Queen's side of the room. His name was not released to the public in the immediate aftermath of the incident, but within royal circles he was known as someone who prided himself on his composure and his ability to read any room. He was not a man who made mistakes. He had escorted senior royals through crowds of thousands, and had managed high-pressure security situations without flinching, and had earned the trust of multiple members of the royal family over the years. So when the incident happened, it was not just shocking because of who was involved. It was shocking because nobody would have expected this particular man to be at the center of it. The meeting had been going on for about 20 minutes when the tension began to build. It started subtly, the way most things in royal settings do. Queen Camilla had been listening to the briefing with the kind of composed attention that she had long mastered. She rarely showed impatience in official settings, even when she felt it. She had learned over the years how to sit through lengthy presentations, how to respond graciously, and how to maintain an expression that gave very little away. But those who knew her well could see the signs. There was a slight tightening around her jaw. Her hands, which had been resting loosely in her lap, had moved to grip the armrests of her chair. She was not happy with something that was being said. The officer presenting the briefing had made a comment. It was a comment related to a decision that had apparently been made within the security team without being communicated to the Queen in advance. The details of what exactly was said have never been fully disclosed. What is known is that the comment touched on something that Camilla felt strongly about, something that she believed should have been brought to her attention earlier. In the world outside the palace, this might have resulted in a sharp verbal exchange or a stiff formal complaint. Inside the palace, it was expected to be handled with measured words and a great deal of diplomatic restraint. Camilla chose a different response. The officer had leaned slightly toward her to make a point, and in that moment, she struck him. Not with great force, not with the kind of blow that leaves a mark, but sharply enough that everyone in the room heard it and felt the jolt of what had just happened. The sound of the impact cut through the quiet of the room like a crack in thin ice. For a split second, everything froze. The officer straightened immediately, his face unreadable, his training overriding whatever physical or emotional reaction he might have felt. The other staff members stood very still. The aides near the door did not move. And then King Charles stood up. He rose from his seat slowly but deliberately, the way a man does when he has made a decision and intends to follow through on it. Those present described his expression as one of quiet intensity. He was not panicked. He was not angry in the explosive sense. He was focused. He crossed the small distance between his chair and where Camilla was seated, and he placed his hand on her shoulder. He spoke to her quietly, in a voice low enough that the words did not carry to the others in the room. She looked at him. Something passed between them in that glance. The kind of communication that happens between two people who have spent years learning each other, who can say something true and real without raising their voices or making a scene. After a moment, the king turned to the officer. He spoke to him directly, acknowledged what had happened with a brief and measured word, and then signaled with a small gesture that the meeting was to be concluded. The remaining staff were guided out of the room efficiently, and within a few minutes, the formal gathering had dissolved. What happened behind those doors after that point was not witnessed by anyone outside the inner circle. But what those who had been present could not stop thinking about was the speed of the king's response. He had not hesitated. He had not waited to see how the situation would resolve itself. The moment his wife struck that officer, he was on his feet. It was a reflex, but it was a deliberate one. It said something about the man behind the crown, about the husband beneath the formal title. In the days that followed, the story made its way through the channels that palace stories always travel through. The staff members spoke to one another in careful terms, each one aware that public disclosure of such an incident carried its own set of consequences. For a time, it seemed as though the event would remain entirely contained within the palace walls. But in a world where information eventually finds a way through even the most carefully maintained barriers, pieces of the story began to emerge. Those who were willing to speak, always anonymously, always with the caveat that they were sharing only what they had personally witnessed, described the incident in terms that were consistent with one another. They agreed on the sharpness of the moment. They agreed on the silence that followed. And they agreed on the speed with which the king had moved. One person who had been near the door described it as the most human thing they had ever seen in that building, because it stripped away the ceremony and the protocol and revealed something underneath that was simply real. Queen Camilla's relationship with the royal household has always been a complex one. She came into the royal family under circumstances that were watched and judged by millions, and she spent years working to establish herself in a role that was never going to be easy. She was not a young woman when she became queen consort, and she brought with her a lifetime of experience, strong opinions, and the kind of forthright personality that had always been a part of who she was. She was not someone who suppressed her reactions easily, even when the setting demanded it. And those who knew her well understood that there were certain things, certain matters of respect and process that she felt very strongly about. The officer in question, for his part, handled the aftermath with exactly the professionalism that his years of service had built into him. He did not file a formal complaint. He did not speak to anyone outside the appropriate channels. He returned to his duties the following day as though nothing unusual had occurred. His colleagues noticed a certain quietness in him over the next several weeks, but he gave no indication of resentment or bitterness. Whatever he felt about what had happened, he kept it to himself. The king's handling of the situation was discussed in whispered conversations among the senior staff. There was a recognition that what he had done was both appropriate and remarkable. And he had intervened without escalating. He had managed the moment with a combination of authority and tenderness that was difficult to achieve under pressure. He had made it clear that what had happened was not acceptable, while also making it equally clear that his first concern was his wife. He had done it all in the space of a few minutes, in a room full of witnesses, without losing the composure that the role demanded. What that moment revealed about the relationship between Charles and Camilla was something that had always existed beneath the public surface, but rarely became visible in such an unguarded way. Theirs was not a simple love story. It had been complicated and painful, and had played out across decades in the full glare of public scrutiny. By the time they married in 2005, and they had been through more together than most couples could imagine, and by the time Charles became king in September 2022, they had settled into a partnership that was forged from all of that history and tempered by the enormous weight of what they now carried together. Camilla was not a woman who needed rescuing. She had proven that clearly over the years. But what Charles did in that moment was not about rescuing her. It was about standing with her, about making sure that she was not left alone in the middle of something that had gone sideways, about being, before anything else, a husband. The royal household returned to its usual rhythms within a few days. The briefing was eventually rescheduled, and the security matter at the center of the original meeting was addressed through the appropriate channels. The officer who had been struck was reassigned to a different post within the protection services, a move that those familiar with the situation described as practical rather than punitive. Life inside the palace continued as it always does, with its rituals and its formalities and its carefully maintained sense of order. But the story of that afternoon lived on in the memories of those who had been present. It lived on because it was so unexpected, because it happened in a setting where almost everything is expected and controlled and managed down to the smallest detail. It lived on because it showed that even in the most formal and carefully maintained environment in the country, human nature finds a way through. And it lived on because of what happened in those few seconds after the strike, and when the King of England rose from his chair and walked toward his wife. In those seconds, he was not a monarch responding to a breach of protocol. He was not a sovereign managing a sensitive incident within the royal household. He was a man who saw his partner in a difficult moment and moved toward her without thinking. He was Charles. And for those who were in that room and saw it happen, that quiet, deliberate movement from his chair to her side was something they would carry with them for a long time. Not because it was dramatic, not because it was scandalous, but because it was so deeply and unmistakably human. And in a world where royalty is so often expected to be anything but, that turned out to be the most striking thing of all.